Excellent. Welcome, anyone who's out there, and welcome to my Binyam. We're thrilled to have you here at Pioneer Works. Broadcast live, radio hour, second Sundays in August. Your very wonderful debut novel just came out a week or so ago, if I'm getting the date right, Hangman. And thrilled to have you here to talk about this book, how it came to be, what it is, what it feels like to have it out in the world. How does it feel to have it out in the world?
It feels good. It feels really good. I mean, it still doesn't feel quite like a book to me, but it becomes more and more like a book every time I see it in hardcover form in places where books normally are. So
Yes.
yeah,
It exists as an object.
Yes, it exists. It exists. And I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Great. Yeah, delighted. And I have a million things I'd love to ask you about this book. The sort of themes that it touches on: migration, refuge, Black refuge, and any number of other sort of more literary things. But one thing I want to sort of start off with is to sort of think about and talk about the voice that carries this book. It's this remarkable voice, the voice that narrates it. It's narrated by this character who's traveling, returning to a home country, if you like, after many years away. And I want to ask you about where this voice came from, how it came to you. But I wonder, just by way of starting here, if we could hear a bit of that voice. So I think you're just going to read from the beginning of the book, if I'm correct.
Yeah, I'll just read right from the beginning. So I don't think any context is necessary, except I will stop reading slightly abruptly.
Great, go on.
All right, here's how it goes. In the morning, I received a phone call and was told to board a flight. The arrangements had been made on my behalf. I packed no clothes because my clothes had been packed for me. A car arrived to pick me up. The radio announced traffic due to an accident involving a taxi cab driver, a police officer, and a woman whose occupation the dispatcher did not specify. But there was no traffic. My ticket was in the breast pocket of my jacket, which was handed to me as I exited the passenger door. Waiting in line, I felt I had no body, but by the time I reached security, I was hungry. Inside my carry-on, I found 2 apples and a croissant, which tasted like nothing. The security agent asked me for my name. I gave him my driver's license, walked through the metal detector, and then my body went away. Before takeoff, a flight attendant announced our destination. Everyone cheered. The passenger to my right asked if I was happy to be going home. He didn't speak our destination's national language, which had become the language of the plane. I told him I was neither happy nor unhappy. He said he understood where I was coming from because his work had introduced him to people like me. He said that people like me had changed his life. It was true that they needed money, but the fact that he gave it to them had nothing to do with who they were to him. His real life, outside of our destination, was complicated by ambivalence. Since childhood, his basic needs had been met as if by an invisible force. At first, he believed his mother and father were providing for him, but when they died, he was surprised to feel he had suffered no loss. Care, he realized, didn't originate within his parents, whose protection remained palpable in almost everyone he encountered. Waitstaff, his internist, even the prime minister. It had merely taken up residence in their bodies, which he didn't need to visit, because the cemetery had nothing to do with the rest of his life. He looked cautious when he mentioned that word, cemetery, as if he had accidentally said a slur. When he was done worrying about being offensive, he moved on to talking about his wife. Things had come to her easily. As soon as they got married, she wanted children, and then she gave birth to 2. She considered recipes to be extraneous. Instead, she ordered cooking magazines and then reproduced the food on the cover page from sight. He had no use for leftovers because his office provided a catered lunch. Everyone he worked with had been elevated to the status of a boss. They made a lot of money but weren't fond of discussing it, especially not with people like me. He appreciated the fact that people like me didn't have desires. His desires felt paralyzing because they weren't motivated by need. Everything was available to be possessed, which made it impossible to quantify an object or person's relative allure. He wished he felt more lust for his mistress. I tried to relate to him and understand his concerns. I'll stop there.
Lovely. And I think that line, actually, I tried to relate to him and understand his concerns, is a kind of emblematic statement from this narrator, is it not?
Yeah. It kind of sums up the interactions that he has throughout the book.
Right,
for
indeed.
sure.
And he's someone who, essentially this ticket has been arranged for him.
Mm-hmm.
He's returning on this journey, which is a weighty journey to
Mm-hmm.
connect with family and a brother who's unwell, and death sort of hovers over this.
Mm-hmm.
But he has this sort of strangely detached relationship to sort of stuff that's happening to him.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if you could just talk about, because this is such a striking, laconic voice, how did this voice come to you? Did you sit down one day and say, "Oh, I can channel this guy. I can do this"?
No, it certainly didn't happen like that. It's a good question, and it's one that I think I tend to kind of answer evasively, in part because it's really difficult to track the emergence of the voice. I've been writing in some iteration of the voice for many years, and the character that's attached to the voice typically has the same biographical details, though I've written kind of stories that take place in various periods of his life. And of course, the voice has also shifted as and become like more crystallized, I would say, as I've sort of written through it. And, everything that I've that I've read has influenced the voice in ways that I can't quite track. But I will say, and I guess I haven't said this yet, but a big part of the voice does come from writings that family writings that I've happened upon. I read many years ago this diary that my father had written that was sort of about a journey to visit his brother, and the circumstances of that visit were completely different from the ones that appear in this book. But it was a kind of, a diaristic travelogue. And there were, I guess there was a style of observation that was very compelling to me in that diary that I've been kind of like working with, essentially. Like that was, I think, essentially the genesis. And things have kind of become transformed in ways that I can't quite trace since then. But I do think that diary was kind of they are mysterious. But I do think that diary was the origin, but it's also become mine in many ways. It's kind of confusing.
No, indeed. But that's the sort of magic of novel writing, right?
Yeah.
And you're someone who writes analytic prose and journalism as well. And of course, crafting a voice in that idiom is a different thing. You're creating yourself as a character.
Right.
But in this case, right, this striking voice that you've sort of come to from these various sources and is now your own, there's a couple sort of notable things about it. And I think as you have described it previously, I have the benefit of having read some previous interviews and press that you've done with this book, which has been so warmly received. But you have recalled, or sort of described this voice or this narrator as an extremely reluctant one. Right? That he's certainly observational and often really funny. As I say, these people are saying this, but they mean this. And this is how human beings behave. He's this sort of, great anthropologist.
Right.
But he's absolutely resistant to sort of ascribing larger meaning or saying, this is what this means, right? But I wonder if you could talk about just what that means to you in the sort of literary shape of a book, right? What is it to kind of, in this literary idiom of writing a novel, to play with a reluctant narrator?
Yeah, I mean, it was fascinating to write through the voice of someone who, as you've said, is very resistant to narrative meaning making. He kind of wants the things that appear before him to be what they are. He has a sort of aspirationally objective view of the world.
Right.
And he's not, he doesn't think descriptively. Obviously, all of the narration is within his own head, but yeah, he doesn't think descriptively. There are very few adjectives in the book. There are no metaphors, and there is symbolism, but it's not. He doesn't have a symbolic understanding of things, and he's like I said, he's reluctant for anything to be other than what it is. And so if there's symbolism in the book, it happens through repetition, through displacement, through something appearing where it shouldn't be. And that was kind of an interesting challenge to me, but it did originate within the character who is not a writer. He doesn't have a writerly sensibility, which isn't to say that he doesn't have a kind of narrative understanding of things. Like he actually is quite smart about the narratives that are expected to sort of originate within him by virtue of the various circumstances that he's been in. Like he knows that he was an exile. He knows that he was a refugee, and that he is an immigrant returning to his home country. And by virtue of those various subject positions, he knows that people want from him a particular kind of story. He says at one point in the book, he's writing an email home to his wife, or attempting to write an email home.
I was going to say, I love this moment.
Yeah.
He says, immigrant stories are supposed to be sad, right?
Yeah, or he says that the story of the immigrant returning to his home country is supposed to be a good one. It's supposed to be a happy story.
Right.
It's supposed to be one in which the sort of protagonist feels welcomed, feels recognized, is kind of brought back to a space of familiarity.
Right.
And he, up until that point, has experienced something that's very different. He's very alienated. He hasn't been able to recognize his family. He's eaten all this food, but it's causing horrible indigestion. And he nevertheless writes a kind of fictitious email to his wife saying that he's had a wonderful 24 hours. He's being treated like a king, blah, blah, blah.
Totally.
Yeah. So he has some sense of what kind of story is expected from him. And he's willing to produce that story, even if it doesn't cohere to his reality.
Right. Indeed. And I was going to say, there's some wonderful scenes just in internet cafes.
Yeah.
And this where he's thinking through, here's what I'm supposed to, emails are a kind of storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, here's the kind of story I'm supposed to tell my wife about. Yeah, it's supposed to be a kind of good story, but I'm going to hint that I have some problems. But now I'm going to leave the internet cafe.
Yeah.
And it's really
I love
funny.
internet cafes.
I know, they're a particular kind of space.
Yeah, and I haven't been to one in a really long time.
I know, right? Well, now we have these phones. Which,
unfortunately.
But it used to be when one traveled, it was like internet cafes were such a
it's like that's where you go to experience your life in the other place for like half an hour or whatever.
Exactly. Pay for your 15 minutes.
Yeah.
And, but I was going to say about his sort of symbolic or anti-symbolic sensibility. There's a great line in the book where he says he's perhaps talking with a taxi driver or someone, and he says, what does $10 symbolize? One good sandwich or two not so good sandwiches. There's my symbolism. Right? It's like this is the way his mind works.
Right.
But you just spoke a moment ago about the sort of stories that are expected of migrants of different kinds, right? And I want to talk about the sort of different categories of migrants that we sort of live with in our contemporary world, refugees being one of them. But he has this sense, right, that okay, migrant returning home is supposed to tell one kind of story, a good story. The stories we expect of refugees are perhaps meant to be another kind of story, a story of sort of narrating hardship or escape or how awful where they come from is, right? And I want to ask you about that by way of just reading a line from, there's a wonderful write-up about the book this week, by the New Yorker writer Julian Lucas, who says, I thought he really encapsulated something early in the piece. He says, narrative is one of the many tariffs that the world exacts from the uprooted. But what happens when the vagaries of displacement don't add up to a story, or at least not one that its subject is willing to tell? And I thought Julian really caught something there about sort of what this book enacts. This reluctant narrator who has been uprooted in more ways than one, what does that add up to, right? Does that description ring true for you of the book, or what sort of animates it?
Yeah, it does ring true for me. I mean, I think it's complicated because he is willing to tell a particular kind of story. He's willing to tell, like we were just talking about, that story about a kind of like wondrous return in that email to his wife. He's also willing to tell a story about himself in which his life in the country where he sought refuge is resourced, it's happy, he has a stable income.
Right.
Like he really holds on to that image of himself, which is a conventional story. It's a story that I think is sort of is propagated by the process of seeking refuge in a country like the US, which is that's kind of like a narratively generative process in order to find refuge in the States. Like you mentioned,
Right.
someone must tell a very particular kind of story about their home country. It must be a story in which they appear as vulnerable to persecution, to suffering, to potential death by virtue of their belonging to a collective that's being persecuted. And then that is sort of rendered in distinction to the life that they're meant to find once they are sort of once they're accepted into the refuge, which is it's not there is no formal definition in the States, but obviously it connotes safety and livelihood and life itself. And he, I think, by virtue of having gone through that process, he's very attached to that story about his life post-refuge. And we only really catch glimpses of it. We don't see him in his home country except for that very first paragraph where he's in the taxi and arriving at the airport. But he does make reference to himself in these kind of oblique ways, especially in distinction to the people who he's encountering in his home country, who he tends to view almost metonymically for the state of the country itself. And he sees them as, oftentimes, not in all cases, as like impoverished and under-resourced, whereas he tends to see himself as, as a respectable, resourced guy.
Right.
Yeah.
As you put it, I think at one moment, he has trouble shedding the vantage of diaspora.
Yeah.
It's perhaps a fair way
Yes.
to put this, right?
Yeah.
And this, speaking of sort of refuge and the sort of craziness of this system, or the ways in which we try and respect and enact the human right of people to movement, for one thing, and all the other human rights that we allegedly avow, to safety and education and rights and so on, that there is this sort of crazy system that people have to come and tell a story to a bored bureaucrat who's going to decide whether it's sad enough to admit them or not. But I wonder if you could talk about this sort of category of Black refuge. And you sort of alluded to it a moment ago about the ways in which the sort of systemic things at work in applying for refuge, if one has come from a society where that's perhaps a possibility because of war or whatever else.
Right.
But to apply for refuge in a place where Black life is perhaps not respected.
Yeah.
Or avowed, or choose your word.
Right. I mean, I think like, I think the idea that Black people could find refuge in the U.S., or not that they could find it, but that the state would have the capacity to provide it for Black immigrants in this country.
Right.
Like that's obviously a fictitious myth that's been kind of built up by propaganda, I would say. But I mean, I guess I started thinking about that most explicitly. I mean, I grew up in a community of people, many of whom had found refuge in the States. Some people came here as asylees. Some people came much later under, various other programs. Some people won the visa lottery or whatever. But my father came to the States as a refugee, and many of his friends did too.
Right. From Ethiopia.
Yes,
correct?
from Ethiopia, yeah. And I think, I mean, when I was a kid, it was very clear to me that that whatever refuge had been created was co-created among the people that I was raised with. I mean, legally, refuge is supposed to be a temporary thing.
Right.
People pass through it. People don't come here and then live in refuge forever. It's supposed to be, like a temporary kind of thing.
Right.
And people are then meant to be able to return back to their home countries. And many of the people, like I said, that I was raised by, stayed here permanently. They didn't go back. And this temporary state became permanent, and the sort of tenets of refuge, the sort of safety that's meant to be provided by the state, it seemed very clear to me from a young age that the state did not have the capacity to provide that. And if people were finding safety, it was because, like I said, they were kind of covertly making it themselves.
Right.
So I kind of witnessed that as a kid, and then as I got older, I don't know, I think I've kind of had a two-pronged approach to it. I've like had the personal experience of sort of like living in this kind of confusing embodied thing, and then
Right.
I've tried to think about it from like a more analytic or distanced
Sure.
approach, and the conflation of those two things, I guess, produces a novel. But but for a while, when I was in college, I was studying the various intersections of the immigration system and anti-terrorism programs.
Right.
And they're basically, I mean, it just becomes very clear how Black immigrants, as soon as they come to the U.S., become targets of the state,
Right.
whether because they get sort of folded into American Blackness and are sort of like processed in the wake of slavery, or because
Sure.
they in particular are seen as foreign agents that are threats.
Or a
Are
threat of
threats.
some
Yeah,
kind.
yeah,
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah.
And I want to get back to our sort of narrator's quest and the things that befall him, and he ends up, he's sort of he's progressing, or sort of not progressing through this journey,
Yeah.
through his home country, and he loses his wallet and loses his passport,
Yeah.
and is sort of oddly passive in sort of confronting these hardships. Right? He says, I preferred to just sort of be ignorant and see what happens.
Yeah.
Right. But there is this theme sort of hovering over it, and it remains kind of enigmatic throughout. But that his brother's not well. There's sort of a death that has occurred or is to occur, and he has this moment. It's sort of a line that really struck me in the book, where he says, death was a communal process. He observes, even if you wanted to experience it alone. And this is one of his lovely anthropological insights, and saying, I don't really want to be a part of this, but I don't have a choice in this culture. But I wonder if you could talk about that, about the ways in where that sort of sentiment comes from, both for him in the context of the story, but also in your sort of thinking about rituals around death, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I think for him, he's kind of referencing a specific practice that he's been raised with, but sort of alienated from by virtue of the fact that he's found life in another country, in which, when someone dies, it's described more explicitly in the book, but everyone's sort of brought into the fold of that death. I think it's quite different than how death is often treated in the States, which is an extremely individuating process. And I grew up with these sort of concrete rituals of death, typically traditionally in Ethiopia, when someone dies, it's not as if the person who's closest to them will be told immediately. Oftentimes their friends and family will tell each other first, and then tell the person who's sort of closest to the person who has died that that someone's been lost. And that process can become very protracted when someone's living in diaspora. And even when they aren't, it's kind of a highly theatrical process in my experience. And a very empathetic one. That moment of reveal, the moment at which someone is told that they are about to begin grieving. It's kind of it's just an incredible feat of empathy, and there's a lot of sort of like grief mirroring that happens.
Like grief is performative.
Yes,
right?
yeah, and
can be.
And it's like I said, in my experience, it's been very special, and also very strange, and and theatrical, and can involve a lot of deception.
Right.
And I've experienced that throughout my life.
Right.
And that's sort of one side of my family. The other side of my family is American, and I sort of grew up on that side without any rituals of death. Death was something that I think I was sort of incentivized to believe was not worth thinking about, really.
Right.
Like it was just something that was inevitable, but also wouldn't happen. There's that kind of
a very American sort of
right. It's a fact of life.
It.
It's inevitable, but also don't worry about it.
Yeah.
And I think I kind of internalized that. I also wasn't a spiritual child.
Right.
I was a kind of adamant atheist for some reason.
Right.
Before I knew how horrible atheism can be, and before I had experienced significant loss.
Right.
And
you needed something.
Yes,
something some stories to tell.
Yeah, exactly. And that was a particular kind of story. And I think as I got older, I realized that maybe I would need something else if I was going to if I was going to live through the deaths of people that I loved. And this tradition is one that, the tradition I described at first is one that was highly familiar to me, but also one that I felt kind of like alienated from. So I think and in ways that are similar to how the narrator is alienated from it. I mean, it like encourages a paranoid reading of reality.
Right.
And I haven't been in the position of that paranoid reading, but I've watched people close to me sort of become fearful that death has happened, but isn't entirely visible yet, but maybe will be visible if you learn to read things correctly.
But is imminent,
if that makes sense.
Yes. Yeah. No, indeed.
Yeah. Like I don't know. I can give a specific example, but there was this one time my stepmother was throwing a surprise birthday party for my father, and we're not big birthday people, so it was kind of strange that she was doing that, but a very nice thing that she was planning for. So in the days leading up to the party, she was doing all of this cooking, and he was very confused. He saw her cooking, and he was like, "This is way too much food for us for the week. Why are you cooking this?" And she was like, "Oh, so-and-so is going to Ethiopia. Like, we're going to have, a goodbye thing." And he's like, "It doesn't make sense. People go to Ethiopia all the time. We don't have goodbye parties for them." Anyway, he got very paranoid that someone in Ethiopia had died. So he started calling all of his family and was like, "Is everyone okay?" He basically he became tortured and did do that kind of paranoid reading. And on the day of the surprise party, everyone gathered, and he was very scared. And then of course they said happy birthday or whatever, but he wasn't really relieved. There's a photo of them where everyone's very happy and he's in the middle just looking completely traumatized.
I love it.
Yeah.
It's also, there's a great moment where the narrator's like, he has these very funny tossed off lines about, in my experience, guarantees are not guarantees.
Yeah.
Something might happen, like death.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed, that may happen at any time.
Yes.
Right. But speaking of this sort of narrative of return, and this book begins with, his story begins with this sort of moment of return on the plane. A man actually dies next to him on the plane, which is a sort of first imminence of something. But he gets off the plane, he's sort of looking, there's this very poignant moment about, again, sort of apropos of this idea that a narrative of return should be a good one in some way, of some nostalgia met or old friend encountered or whatever. And he essentially doesn't have these experiences. But he says at one point, he says, "I kept looking for someone among them, and they kept looking for someone among me," right? Which is a lovely sort of layered assertion of many things, right? That he sort of contains multitudes, as it were. But what can you say about the sort of ways in which you felt or wrote this character sort of experience of disconnection at home, or the ways in which his experience of homecoming is perhaps, it's at least an ambiguous and ambivalent one. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. So what? Sorry, can you say that your question again? What
Absolutely.
are the? Yeah.
Yeah. No, totally. The ways in which, so this, would you say that his return is a sort of ambivalent or ambiguous one for him?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, he's not choosing to go back. Like, he's sent back, and he isn't quite sure why. And he's like, well, if I'm going back, I might as well feel happy about it, right? Like, I know that this is a big moment in one's life. The moment that you return home to the place that you've been gone from, in his case, for, 26 years. Yeah. Like, he's like, okay, this is a big deal. He doesn't have control. But he's like, but if I'm going, then I might as well try to enjoy it. I might as well try to find the people I know. I might as well be excited about these foods that I haven't eaten for a very long time. He kind of tries to manufacture the stories that we were talking about that are expected of him. And I think that's in part because he does want to feel those things. Like he does want to feel like he belongs to collective life again. He wants to feel like he's among people who regard him as familiar. And at the same time, he's very attached to his sense of self and his sense of himself as separate from other people. Mm-hmm. And I think navigating those competing impulses and those competing desires produces what looks like a kind of like emotionlessness, or affectlessness. But I think he actually has like these kind of, just strong competing desires that are pulling him in a bunch of different directions.
Absolutely. Yeah. And always that resistance to sort of overarching narratives or sort of ascriptions of meaning or analysis. Right? Yeah. And I want to sort of return before we get to a last thing I want to talk about, to this, the particular nature of his resistance to people ascribing meaning or analyzing what's going on. Because as you just mentioned, he's someone who's very attached to his individuality. And of course, one thing that novel does is give us, novels in general, and this novel in particular, give us access to an individual subjectivity or consciousness. Right. It's about these weighty themes of migration and rights, and many people who have already read and sort of love this book sort of point to, it's about these things. Right. But there are ways in which he sort of resists it being about, it's about systemic stuff. He's like, no, this is my experience. It's a kind of ridiculous one. It's a kind of sad one. Yeah. People are flawed. Yeah. Right. And he says, there's a great great scene where he's listening to these grad students, right, and says something about, this is how smart people got away with making their ill-founded points by speaking on behalf of people who feel ill-equipped to speak for themselves. Right. Yeah. Which again, I think sort of encapsulates something about him. Right. Fair to say. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. I think that line, it's always funny to talk about the book because I wrote it pretty impulsively, which is often. I mean, I think that's often the case for writers, even if they believe that they went into it with a kind of scaffolding. I think the writing itself is often, like impulsive, and by virtue of that, strange and weird subconscious things emerge. But I wrote that line, and afterward I was like, that's kind of a dig at me too, because totally. I'm, in a great way. Yeah, you gotta be vulnerable. Yeah. No, but I agree. About this point about outline. I was gonna say I feel this way, and I even say it when I teach writing. It's like I often need an outline. I find that writers do, but then it's like, or better put, writing something, feeling a voice or an idea, and then having an outline, so as to then just hopefully get in the zone of where you're not thinking about an outline. You're just writing. That's where you want to get. Yes, definitely. I'm not an outliner at all, but
I've heard from people that even if they don't have it, the point is to move, or even if they have one, the point is to move away from it.
Totally.
Yeah.
Well, this is the thing, right? It's like we write. It's like tricking yourself into writing.
Yeah.
It's a big part of our days. Those of us who suffer in this vocation. But I wanted just to return, if we could, to this question of, okay, sort of what it's about. And we, of course, live in this moment when, upwards of 300 million people in the world today live outside the country of their birth. It's been said that, the migrant is the emblematic sort of modern, postmodern figure, the emblem of our age. And I think it would seem to me that this book is already having this sort of lovely life. It's getting around and people are sort of, oh, it's about this moment, right? And absolutely, it's about this moment. How could it not be? But you've said, I read a quote from you in an interview you gave recently about, certainly there's a politics to this book, to your work. There's a politics to everything we do. But you said something about the ways in which if the book has a political project, it's a surreptitious one. And this relates back to obstruction. I want readers to feel alienated, perhaps from their ingrained associations with how certain signifiers work, or the ways in which we're supposed to think about migration, for example.
Right.
But talk about that. What's that alienation you want people to wrestle with, or think they might be wrestling with?
Yeah. I mean, I think in the context of that interview, I was talking about how countries as they appear in words, so like the name that's given to a country, like Ethiopia is what I was referencing.
Right.
For various people, that word will connote all kinds of stories.
Sure.
And I was just thinking about this actually because I was in Boston.
Yeah.
I just got back a couple of hours ago, and all of my family lives in Boston, pretty much all of them. And last night we had a big party, and there were like 40 people there. We were all sitting around. Almost everyone who was there, besides my mom and a couple friends, almost everyone was Ethiopian. So they were born in Ethiopia, or they are the children of people who were born in Ethiopia. And basically for the duration of the party, we were sitting around and talking about Ethiopia, talking about people's past experiences there, talking about like current events, politics, but it was all about Ethiopia. It was a bunch of people sitting around a house in Boston talking about a place that was very, very far away.
Right.
And there's something to me that's like deeply sad about that and melancholy. But there's also something amazing happening too, which is that like together we're creating this place that isn't quite the place that's sort of geographically fixed in space.
Right.
It has some relation to that, but mostly it's about the people who are sitting in the room, who are sort of like collectively creating this mythology about a place that they left behind.
Right.
And I'm very interested in that. I'm very interested in how, I guess like nations are built through displacement, and how they're changed because of it. I think oftentimes in narratives of migration, be they fictional or non-fictional or whatever, there's often talk about how the immigrant herself is changed by virtue of her migration. And I'm really interested in how the sort of place that she leaves behind, or the place that she goes to, how those places are in fact changed by the displacement of the bodies who used to populate it, and through the storytelling that they then do once they've left. So I think that's kind of what I was getting at. I'm not sure when I did that other interview, I was thinking about it so concretely, but I was thinking about it last night.
No, I love that. And the ways in which, a place or a place name becomes a story and becomes a kind of thing to organize community around in a new location. And I have a friend here. I mean, Brooklyn, I think, is a wonderful even context for stories like this. Obviously, there's people from all over the world, but there's ways in which I have friends from Jamaica, for example, talk about how, it's sort of heavily Jamaican parts of Flatbush or parts of Brooklyn, where it's like, it's almost it's deeply Jamaican, but it's Jamaican of a certain moment. Of like X number of years ago, where it's like, oh, okay, like this was the thing.
Totally.
Then, and there's like an investment in the place.
Totally.
Down by Coney Island, it's like Russia circa 1995. Right?
Yeah.
It's like this ways in which feeding on nostalgia, a certain vision of place.
Right.
But It's a lovely segue to a book we were chatting about before we got on air, which is a book and a sort of literature that I think we both have a love for. And I'm thinking in particular of a wonderful book by Sam Selvin, The Lonely Londoners, which is now, it's probably 70 years old at this point, written in late 50s. Yeah. I know, right? Late 50s, early 60s. But the reason I mention it, right, and I was just thinking as you were talking about Ethiopian community and family in Boston, is what's enabled by not being in the place, or what stories sort of adhere to it, or what new communities emerge. Because this book, Sam Selvin's Lonely Londoners, is about Caribbean immigrants to London right after the war. Sam Selvin being an East Indian or South Asian writer from Trinidad. But there's this wonderful sense in that, speaking of Black refuge, about the ways in which he and other people from the Caribbean are sort of, they become Black, for one thing, in the UK. Right. And also sort of have this new sense of community, of being West Indian or Caribbean. Yeah. In a way that in the islands, you don't have that at all. Right. But that book, and I mentioned it, I sort of cheated, you mentioned it as something that you love. And I said, oh, great, Maya loves The Lonely Londoners. I don't know many people who I can talk with about this book. But what do you love about that book?
Oh, I mean, so many things. It's it's a really funny book filled with lots of antics that seem to not contribute to a kind of central plot that's progressing forward. It's a book full of diversions and full of strange characters. I mean, it reminds me in that way. Have you read The Wedding of Zayn?
No.
It's a Talib Saleh book, and it's it takes place in Sudan, and it's sort of around the wedding of this one character, but there are lots of sort of side stories of various other characters who might be considered random if you're thinking about, like I said, like conventional plot, but in fact they add to the atmosphere of the book, and the book is ultimately about the atmosphere that's being conjured by the various characters. And I think Sam Selvin's book, The Lonely Londoners, does that beautifully. And that isn't to say there is a protagonist in that book, and things do happen to him, and characters reappear, but it's a different way of writing a novel that's like it is a more collective mode of storytelling, but that also feels kind of flattening or vague or something.
Sure, no.
I don't. What do you love about that book?
I love. Well, this is that sense of collective storytelling, but just conviviality in a way, and the sort of conviviality that's sort of not only possible but sort of necessary for people who have changed contexts and are sort of figuring out a way to be affirmed and joyful and connected and sort of what does that look like, right? And I had a particular. I mean, I've spent a lot of time in Trinidad and sort of Caribbean literature, is a big sort of passion of mine, and I love the ways in which that book sort of it sort of transcends certain of the kind of rivalries and sort of things that happen in the place where the writer is from. Yeah. Right? And thinking, oh, this is what community can look like. Right. This is what refuge can look like. That we create ourselves. Right. Actually, to return to that. Right. That idea.
Right. Right. And there's a lot of like ugly sentiment there too. Sure. Like a lot of resentments and violent. Like yeah. It's such a good book. There's been so much good, I don't know, literature produced, especially from that sort of like vector of migration from the colony or the former colony to the metropole.
Right. Yeah. No, indeed. And this, and this is maybe a nice way to sort of start to move toward a close of this lovely chat.
Yeah, sure.
But I think absolutely that there's this moment, of course, when we think about the larger arc of what you might call the immigrant novel, right, which is a sort of flawed category, but it's something we've been talking about for several decades now, right? Absolutely, that migration from the Caribbean to London, the Caribbean to New York, different migrations from Africa to Europe, right, from Latin America. Obviously, there's many of these sort of flows of people that now have a literature. But this idea, and I think this is, I've loved seeing the ways in which this book has been received. I've loved reading it myself. And I think that one thing it does, right, is that it yes, for one thing, subverts the sort of typical narrative that we expect of the quote immigrant novel, which in part is a narrative like we expect from refugees.
Right. Right.
Here's what happened. Here's why it was hard. Now I'm in between. It's tricky.
Yeah.
You know, there's these tropes that get replayed and replayed. And of course, one thing that this does is it, yes, tells us a human story of return and of ambivalence.
Yeah.
And of the ways in which that is human experience.
Right. Right.
That it's not sort of overdetermined by the things that we want to hang on to it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's what you're saying is reminding me, and have you read Letters from London, the C.L.R. James collection?
I love it.
Yeah, it's so good.
C.L.R. James is a god to me. So
Yes. Okay.
yeah,
Cool.
Yeah.
There's this moment, maybe you remember, in one of the early letters. They're letters that he is writing back. He's publishing them in the West Indies, but they're letters that he's writing from London, where he's recently traveled. And he writes, I think it may be in the first letter, in his first dispatch, he writes, you know, I fit in here just like a pencil fits into a sharpener. Right. Which is, it's amazing. It's like, it's supposed to be this kind of like
there's
jubilant.
Metaphors in it.
Yeah. It's supposed to be this kind of like jubilant statement of belonging, but of course there's like a fundamental violence. And I guess I was interested in, you know, how does the sharpened pencil that's kind of confidently sharpened do when it's back home.
It's such a C.R. James thing to say, right? Because this is this very brilliant writer thinker from Trinidad who from the start, says, yes, I am from the colonies. I inhabit this black body, but I have as much sort of claim to quote Western civilization as anyone. And in fact, I'm going to sort of excel all of you in it and say like, our contributions to it are the contributions that sort of matter and will transcend. No, and I think actually it's great. I love thinking about C.O.R. in the context of this book and these stories, in part because he was someone also who in the academy and the university, he hated the idea of black studies, for example, because he said, how are you going to tell? It's really interesting because you could picture it. He's like, how are you going to try and tell the story of the new world, of the Americas of the last 500 years without putting sort of black life and experience and culture at the center of it, right? It's not this separate thing. Right. He's like, no, it's just history. It's just English. It's just whatever. Right. And which is its own thing. He had his West Indian attitude about it. But I think that, the sort of hope of forging a literature that is a literature of humanity and that centers, that also centers black life in that story, is something you've done in this book beautifully.
Thanks.
So thank you for it. Thank you for this beautiful novel. Everyone needs to read it. Hangman. Thank you for being with us to talk about it.
Yeah, thanks for having me and for your great questions.
So much fun.
Yeah, so much fun.
We could keep talking, but we'll leave it at that. Go get a spritz in the garden. Yes. So thank you once again, Maya.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone who is listening, who will listen, and Hangman. Thanks everyone. Broadcast Radio Hour, Pioneer Works.